Well, welcome everyone. Really appreciate you joining today. This is Jason Hickey, President and CEO of Hickey & Associates. We're really excited to have you, but first and foremost, we want to make sure you're safe, healthy, in this extreme trying times. I've used a lot of different words to describe it, from unprecedented to unbelievable to many different things that barely scratches the surface. But the one thing we wanted to bring to bear were ideas that we thought were critical in a time where not only do you have this viral pandemic, but also the economic recovery that we need to think about now. We've got, we could be pre-depressionary, definitely very dynamic recessionary times in front of us right now, not only in the US, but beyond. And we feel very strongly it's critical to bring some of these ideas and concepts and just educate you as folks that are interested in economic recovery opportunities to start to think about. And some of these you can take advantage of today. So we're going to go through quite a bit of content today. Real excited to have you here. And if you have any questions, just from quick housekeeping, there's a function within Zoom that's a Q&A function. I'm going to hold all questions to the end, but if you do have a question, feel free to ask it, type it in as you might be thinking about it, and then I'll try to answer as many questions as I can before the top of the hour. We'll open the floor up towards the end to do any Q&A as we talked about, and this is being recorded. So we'll post this on our website and a couple different places. We'll talk about where this will be accessible. If for some reason you have to log off or aren't able to join, or one of your colleagues would like to hear more, this will be available at your disposal moving forward. And as always, I've tried to do my best to make sure that I can have the proper bandwidth here at home. Also, if you hear screaming in the background, it's one of my 3 kids, or maybe all of them combined. Like many of you, I'm working out of my home, and just the next room over, there's lessons being learned and online distant learning happening, and I think overall, if we're probably lucky, Frozen 2 might be on the television. Just like you all at home, we're balancing our personal and professional lives every day in real time, and we just appreciate you joining us today and spending a few minutes with us to learn a little bit more about what we see in the marketplace around these recovery incentives and why they're important, how to think about it today for the future. So with that being said, I want to give just a little bit of background about who we are and who I am. I'm president and CEO of a firm by the name of Hickey or Hickey & Associates. We've got teams all over the country and all over the world that's helping companies before the virus and then today in a lot of different ways, helping with site selection, helping with logistical concerns, helping with analytics around labor and workforce. And then where there's an opportunity to partner with governments, we do that as well. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is in this transformational world, there's all these different dynamics that didn't exist a couple months ago. Certainly, there was a lot of talk, a lot of planning, a lot of things that we've been contemplating around pandemics. Now it's here. And we're dealing with it in ways that are very present day humanitarian concerns. And then in the future, we're going to have to deal with the economic challenges that are going to be in front of us. So that's what we want to talk about today. Before I get started, I want to make sure too, I mention our microsite. It's complimentary, it's free, it's open source, incentives.hickeyandAssociates.com. It's open 24/7 for your benefit, and we're constantly updating in real time. We've had hundreds of thousands of unique visitors. Real excited about it. It's really a platform and a clearinghouse for everything having to do with the recovery and government assistance that could be brought to bear, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. There's programs that are being introduced on a real-time basis, and this is the one-stop shop to help all of you and beyond just identify what might be available. We're here at your disposal too. Contact us anytime. But we felt it very important that we set up a site right away. It's been open for the last couple of weeks, that has the information available to all of you in real time when you're ready to start to engage in some of these. You can find programs that can help, even if it's long-term strategic issues that you might be dealing with, or short-term trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep your employees retained. This database will help you with some tools that are available today, and we're updating it as information becomes available. But so I scanned in my $100 bill, and this is what came up. I thought it was odd, but it was also telling that this is the life that we're leading. And while it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, the site selection revolution, literally, that we're seeing. So we're dealing as a firm. We've got about a dozen projects right now where otherwise we would have been out there doing site tours, trying to help companies identify where they should go next, how they should be expand in a boots in the ground way. Well, now we're having to do that virtually. And we're working with a handful of states, a handful of provinces, a handful of countries to try to figure out how to do virtual site tours, which would be something we'll report on in the future. But pretty fascinating, as you can imagine, and exciting to at least help these companies make decisions in real time now. But the implications are pretty mind-boggling. What existed just a few weeks ago still exists today. There's still the trade war. There's still barriers. There's still tariffs. There's still all these things that existed in February exist or are going to still exist in May, in June, and July, depending on the way things go. They're still in place now. So we always have to contemplate not just what we're dealing with from a pandemic standpoint, but also what's happening with talent. The declining populations, the challenges around skills, the war on talent that we've been referring to, skill set and attainment and attrition is still existing as it did a few weeks ago, still is in place today. Now, there's an awful lot of people that have been, and our thoughts and prayers are with them, that have been adversely affected by the pandemic. And we hope that they can get back to work as soon as possible. But when everything settles back down, and hopefully many people get to go back to their near normal life as it existed earlier in the year, there's still going to be a challenge around skill sets and the declining populations and how to attract that. There's also the workplace of the future. So I used to use this slide quite a bit as a way to show that the picture on the right is where people wanted to go. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And we're doing a lot of analysis and study on what the future might hold. And while it won't be the early 80s like our picture on the left, I think people are going to want personal space again. I think they're going to want to make sure that things are healthy and safe in their own regards and their coworkers. The idea of co-working, the idea of having public spaces, hot desking, things of that nature may take a pretty big pause. And in places where you can't just all of a sudden pull the furniture apart, and you can't create a situation where you're just too close to someone, we need to think about ideas. And to give credit to the Cushman & Wakefield team in the Netherlands, they just announced this actually a few hours ago, and I wanted to share this with everybody. So we're not workplace designers from a architectural standpoint, but I thought this was fascinating because here is a way where they envision their workplace could be into the future. So these black circles are your 6-foot radius. And you can see here in the design, you've got these acrylic barriers between folks, and that's probably a reality because you can't separate these desks in the short term. How do you prevent and help people feeling safe in a world too that you can't automatically and quickly tell if someone has been affected by the virus, and then you can't right away ask someone if they have preconditions that would put them more at risk. You can't really ask people if they have diabetes or they have heart conditions or they have other things outside of a normal HR function. So these are things that a lot of people are thinking about. Do you have to, as you see in the middle picture, is there one-way traffic that goes along with that? And then to give Cushman & Wakefield in the Netherlands a little bit more credit too, you can see that paper that's underneath in the right-hand picture, the keyboard and the mouse. So their idea, and it's an interesting one, is that every day when you come into your workspace, you grab that piece of paper and you put that at your desk. And at the end of each day, you recycle it and you grab a new one each time. Maybe you switch it over multiple periods of time. This is the new normal that we have to think about and how that works. So one more thing, and we'll come back to workplace, especially in a moment, but the other piece is getting people back to work. there's roughly 16 to 20 million people that have claimed unemployment in the U.S. Some of that information is lagging behind a bit, but nonetheless, it is people have been unbelievably infected in the ways that we couldn't even contemplate a few weeks ago. The challenge that we have to look at, well, predominantly people just want to get back to work. They want to get back to their normal life. The way that things have been set up from an unemployment standpoint is that for folks that worked $15 an hour minimum wage in some areas, jobs, they would get about an average of $600 a week. This isn't contemplating overtime or anything like that, just standard. Had they been laid off or furloughed and claimed unemployment in January, December last year, it would be about half that would be $300 would be the benefit. Now with the COVID components of the federal government, that person that would have gotten $300 is now getting $900, which is $300 more than would have made working. So while I think for most people this isn't a disincentive, for some this will be a disincentive to get back to the workplace. Some people are going to need this, no doubt, because a lot of businesses may not survive what's happening. Retail shops, some other things, it's detrimental. So, but over the long term, part of what we do for a living is looking at trend lines and what may happen in the future and how to plan on an analytical basis and a real-time basis what that means. So something we've got to think about is that for the next 39 weeks, someone could receive $300 more a week than they could have received otherwise being in the workforce. And that's something that we're going to have to think about, that some of these lower skilled, basic skilled jobs are going to continue to be absolutely critical for warehouse distribution, for payroll companies, for the companies that have been very successful in taking high school equivalent jobs or jobs in hospitality or jobs in the serving sector to then train them to hopefully increase their wages, to get more benefits, to get more skills. But they've been utilizing these folks a lot in a lot of areas as the skills and the war on talent has raged on. Well, now less is going to be available, less than what we may think as the world begins to go back to normal. This may become a factor. So one thing we want to cover quickly is the emergency relief here in the U.S. I'm based out of New York City, for those of you that don't know. So we've been very adversely affected by the pandemic, and we may be a city that doesn't get relief as far as shelter in place and other things for quite some time. And there's a lot of other cities that obviously may be the case as well. But I think we're hoping for at least short-term relief, and we'll talk about what we think may happen in the future. But emergency relief. So we get a lot of questions all the time. Our phones are ringing off the hook, which is great. We want to help small businesses and large businesses alike and just pointing them in the right direction. But as far as the phases go, and we want to give some guidance here on this call to everybody's benefit. So phase one, all the way back on March 5th, a little bit more than a month ago, seems like forever, but only a month ago, the first phase went into place, which is about 8.3 billion in rapid preparedness vaccine development. It helped get out some of the FEMA relief that we're seeing now already in place. Quick injection. Then on the 18th, there were things like free testing, paid sick leave, paid family leave, increased Medicare, telemedicine, things of that nature. The big one that gets the most attention today is the one that was passed on the 25th of March, which is the big relief components for individuals and businesses. So this was the SBA loaning, the individual checks or account payments that everyone is hopefully going to get here within the next week. If you're direct deposit, they're saying within a month now, as of this morning, the Treasury Department, that people will get live checks. I think we're hoping for the best as could be expected. But there's some additional taxation things that we'll cover in a moment. But the one thing I want to point out is that many of you either help businesses on the economic development side, or you're real estate professionals helping businesses try to figure out what the new normal is going to be, or you're the companies themselves trying to figure out, well, how do I take advantage of any of these programs beyond filling out a Treasury application for the Paycheck Protection Program? And there are some examples of programs available now from the federal government that have been injected with capital. Here's three right here. The Economic Development Administration has a series of grants that are available range the gamut from infrastructure to equipment to feasibility studies. It's pretty robust. And they've received about $1.5 billion extra dollars now. I think we're expecting more soon in any of these programs. About $5 billion for community development block grants, CDBGs as they're called for short. Historically, they've helped with affordable housing. They've helped with a lot, which is still very much the case. But we feel that capital improvements and training offsets are things that can also directly affect companies in different ways. And then USDA rural development, if you're in a jurisdiction with 50,000 or less people or unincorporated, these are great programs. And that literally they've gotten injected with more money they've had in probably since the stimulus in any given time, the 2009 stimulus. And these are great programs. Lending, forgivable loans, direct grants, offsets, things for energy, you name it. USDA rural development in their business and industry loan program is great. And there are different, for each of these organizations, the EDA, HUD, and USDA all have regional representatives that can help you with anything that you need to tap into. But just know it's not well publicized that these programs have been injected this much of capital in an unprecedented way. Definitely get in front of these that may help your business in a significant way. The other one, it's got a lot of press, is the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a great program, PPP for short, as they've called it. And this is a program that really is meant to help small businesses, a small business that I think is something that is very unique, that's very supposed to be not complex, and a lot of businesses have tried to get in front of. In most cases, you would work with your bank that you already have a commercial relationship with. If you don't, there are banks available, though it's not a perfect process. As the national press and local press have discussed in great length, this is a program that's seen its fair share of challenges. And so $350 billion available now. There's some discussions about adding another $250 billion to this. About $100 and $120 billion in that range has been doled out already. Some banks like JP Morgan, Bank of America, US Bank, and the larger ones, the way that it works for them is effectively they're going to loan companies that they've got relationships with and they're building relationships with through this program. They're going to loan directly off their balance sheet, whatever it is that you qualify for. Then the federal government is guaranteeing whatever that is. So if the company defaults, then let's say Bank of America will go back to the Treasury Department and get reimbursed for that. If there's a forgiveness element, which we'll talk about in a moment, that the forgiveness, they'll go back to the Treasury Department and be reimbursed for that. So when they say that there's $150 million doled out, that doesn't necessarily come from Treasury. That's actually coming off the balance sheets of a lot of different financial institutions, and then the mechanisms work from there. How things are going to be equalized. So if you've reported 100 jobs and you say in June or whenever that ends up being, you have to report 100 jobs back in return. Who counts? How does that happen? And how much detail you're going to have to be given is actually a bit unknown. A lot of the qualifying nature of these PPP grants, loans, forgivable loans are based on SBA rules, which has been challenging because if you're from private equity, let's say, you have a rule that you have to follow around affiliation. So if you have different holding company, portfolio companies, one is 200, one's 500, one's 1,000, that adds up to be more than the 500 job requirement, the threshold. So the affiliation rule is one that we've gotten a lot of questions of from VC and PE firms about how to navigate that, and there is some better guidance. So one thing I would say is that if you're Shake Shack, which happens to be one of my favorite restaurants and cheeseburgers, if you are Shake Shack, you can apply for the Paycheck Protection Program, and the current rules as we understand it, those rules are subject to change, and they're posted almost on a daily basis, sometimes more, off the Treasury and SBA websites. But the way those rules work today is that you'll be able to apply for that kind of restaurant by restaurant. If you own a hotel chain or franchise, it's each franchise, each physical location by location, and that's so you don't have to worry about anything in the hospitality industry, restaurant, hotel, things of that nature are exempt from some of those affiliation rules. And that's a brand new clarifying rule that was set about 48 hours ago. So there's a lot of things that are happening. The one thing that's clear is that the cap is 10 million. And to get forgiveness, you have to retain your jobs. Can you replace one job that's, let's say, a full-time with a 1099 job, an independent contractor? That's not clear yet. The answer today is yes. The answer in the future may be different. So we're going to try to keep our microsite updated. And obviously, the buck stops with the SBA website that's handling all of the postings of the different regs as they become available. But one thing I can't stress enough about everything else, there will be oversight. And Inspector General of SBA one day, and it may be 3 years from now, it might be 10 years from now, we'll look at all the lending that they did, and we'll look at all the paperwork they did, and there will be some kind of reckoning eventually. And all we can give you advice on today is do the best you can with the best information you have available, which isn't perfect, but just do it right away. If you haven't applied for this program, do it today. Literally, do it today, because it could be above $1 trillion of applications that have already been submitted. Now, not all of those companies are going to qualify. And the part that stinks, that makes it difficult, is that there's organizations, there's banks that don't know if you can have dashes in your telephone numbers, if the SBA is going to reject those applications or not. And that's the challenge, and that's what's going on. That's the frustration that's building quickly amongst so many companies that need this help now. All I can say, and the best advice I can give you, is apply right now, as fast as you can, just to get into the queue right away. There's economic stabilization financing. So this is the big bucket of $500 billion. In addition to the PPP, that's for banks and air cargo and national security. That application process has started now. They're accepting them. How the government may deal with different entities is case by case. They're really meant for non-small business entities. So if you have 500 or more jobs and you've got this affiliation challenge, this is the direction to go, is this program. Just like the PPP, you have to submit an application today. You got to go on the Treasury website, get that right away, get that process going, because these funds are meant to be dispersed as quickly as possible so that they can help people. And that's the purpose of it. If you're in an area, especially areas that were considered a disaster area, federal disaster area earlier than others, so New York, Louisiana, Chicago, and some others, those early on, many of you maybe have already applied for these loans. So these are the typical disaster loans that are meant for when a hurricane strikes, or tornado, or earthquake, or flood. But it's such a broad scale. SBA is challenged times about 1,000 and trying to navigate. What's different here, a couple things are important. One is that the money comes directly from the SBA. The SBA is your lender. So you have to work directly with them. If you already have a loan or a line of credit or some kind of vehicle of your business that's already encumbered by another lending, your collateral is already encumbered by some other lending agreement, you're going to find a big challenge, because the SBA has very specific requirements on also collateralizing things that you maybe have encumbered somewhere else. Now, the good news is if you have not encumbered other real estate property assets or other things that maybe wouldn't have been more traditional lending from a commercial lender, those can be applicable. But personal guarantees are a part of this too, and many companies try to refrain from that, and that's important. If you need some quick cash to help pay payroll, to help move things forward, there is a very easy, fast way to get $10,000 through this whole process that is forgiven. It's like a free $10,000. The United Kingdom government has something very similar. There's a £10,000, 10,000 quid automatic check that a lot of companies are going to get as well across the country, and so on and so forth. So many places around the world have these programs in place, and the United States is no exception. There's two other programs which I just want to call out. The IRS is trying to develop rules around these quickly. Again, it's totally not clear. I'm pretty sure the federal government in the U.S. broke some world records on speed to have any of this released and ready. But you've got the employee retention tax credit and the additional business tax provisions that are available around Social Security payroll tax. A lot of organizations are just making sure that they understand what the rules of the road is before starting to implement this. And the IRS is trying to put out its guidance as fast as they can around these two programs. The number one question that we're not totally clear on, that guidance does need to be made, is that can you take advantage of these programs and not the PPP or the SBA disaster relief? That question is actually a bit unknown, and we're looking and have been advocating through the faculties that we have in DC, our office in DC, as well as others, just to get a good sense of where things might head next. So stay tuned on our microsite or future webinars in that regard. Excuse me. Then get some really unique things that are out that were funded more robustly, like the Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership that some companies can take advantage of. It helps with some of the small and medium-sized manufacturers to do a lot of different things inside of the box to help with requirements that before had some limitations to it that now doesn't. And there's obviously a lot of money. $50 million is a significant amount that had been offered previously. And this helps things with standardization, manufacturing processes, and so on, that obviously add costs that can help offset. It's not going to solve everybody's problems, but it can help relieve some pressure, some expense pressure if that's what's needed. So I mentioned something earlier about unemployment too. This is a big factor that I mentioned. But what can we expect next? I think that's everybody's question, and I don't know if we know the best answer to that, but we're going to try to tell you the best information that we know at this stage. First and foremost, what's going to happen next? So it appears that within the next 2 weeks, there could be some additional funding for the Paychex program. I think the challenge is Congress doesn't go back until April 20th, the House especially. And I think many of you know that, but no, the challenge is that so just like we don't want people to gather in conferences and places where people have fanned out and then come back. So Congress is faced with a challenge that they're just trying to figure out. The only rule that exists to vote is people have to be present. So now everyone's been back in their districts around the country. They're going to have to come back to DC, sit in that chambers, at least predominantly, and vote. There's no remote voting. So that's scheduled to take place on April 20th. So there doesn't look like currently, and things could change, but it does not look like there will be relief in store and additional money until April 20th, when everybody gets back from recess. And it's more about logistical concerns and the pandemic than anything else, but that's the reality, unfortunately. When everyone gets back, we're looking at an additional round, we'll call it kind of phase 4 of infrastructure funding. It's going to take a couple of months, we think. It could be $2 or $3 trillion in that bucket. And those are going to be supporting mechanisms that are more historically closer to the 2009 stimulus than it would be to anything we've seen so far. So there'll definitely be some direct support, but they'll be utilizing programs that are in place that are like build grants, which used to be called Tiger grants. It's going to include some of the programs that we mentioned earlier, like economic development, agency-related, EDA-related funding, CDBG, things of that nature. It could also include more opportunities for new market tax credits and more allocations perhaps in the future. So there's going to be short-term, and then there's going to be massive infrastructure spending to rebuild bridges and roads and hospitals and VA facilities and a lot of other things in between. There's also going to be massive amounts of money to reimburse state and local county governments, you name it, on all the money that they spend to try to help the humanitarian aspect of this pandemic. So with all that being said, we think there's a lot of opportunities for businesses to tap into, but it's probably a couple of months away. So stay tuned to the microsite. We're going to try to talk about this as much as we can in the interim and get the word out. But I'll point out something that we're going to talk about next, and that's state and local assistance is available now, right now, and that many of the economic developers on the phone are very accustomed to what a normal economic development project or day may look like. Well, those same tools that you've got for not only for growth opportunities, but retention opportunities, where statutes and laws allow, well, they're available now. So one of the things we want to talk about is recovery incentives, but in a different way that you maybe have heard before. There's no doubt there's probably 6 or 7 or 8 different COVID webinars happening right now during this hour. So there's no shortage of people talking about different things. But what we noticed is that there's no one really talking about programs in place that are there right now that can help right now, that can help companies keep their employees, that can help companies grow a little bit, to just keep their operations functioning. There's assistance for companies that have all of a sudden had to add 1,000 employees that just can't keep up with the cost of doing it, to help them along the way, right away and over the long term. So that's what we want to spend the remainder of the hour talking about, and make sure we've got time for everyone's questions. So first, how do they work? So incentive standpoint, there's tax and cash and some lower costs of money and some other things like new market tax credits, opportunity zones, things like that available. And what they do is they help in the impact side of the equation. They help reducing those outlays, reducing the resources required, enhancing the return on investment onto something. So moving it, making that decision happen faster, adding that line, adding that floor, adding 10 more jobs. And when all else fails and a company needs to downsize, there are outplacement incentives available through the federal government and local organizations to help offset the cost of retraining and repositioning employees where they have to be downsized in different ways. So there's government programs that can be extremely important during these times. So some of the things that just rules of the road that are key is that you have to make sure you're fitting within the rules that exist today. So if you're going to take advantage of the 80,000 or more programs that were in place in February, that are in place in April, already in statute, already available around the U.S., and there's tens of thousands more available internationally, you have to remember these rules, where there are rules in statute about competition. The project has to be competitive. There are incentives that are just automatic. There's discretionary incentives where you have to talk to the government and the governor, all the way up to the governor. The mayor has to make key decisions. And you have to look at not only the opportunity from a savings perspective and assistance, but the risk associated to it. You may have to commit just for retention incentives to get some assistance over the short term, just like some of the federal programs, local and state programs. You're going to have to say to them, all right, I've got 100 employees, I'm going to keep them in return for that. And if I don't do it, then I may have to pay some back. Those are the things that are really important to think about, because there's no federal oversight across the whole U.S. like other national governments have. It's state by state, community by community. It varies a bit. So look at these in a way that that's important when you think about opportunities. Incentives have some trigger points to think about as well. So if you're renewing a lease or you're committing to your real estate in different ways, that's one. Making some capital investments, that's another. If you're adding human capital, but I'll say that there are programs in place that you don't need to add human capital to be able to get government aid. And that's key, because a lot of companies are hurting. They're hurting a lot. Some of them are on the brink of going into business and they need help. And while the federal government is trying to do what they can, it's falling short in a lot of different ways. And not on purpose, but just by accident, the assistance not coming fast enough. So there are opportunities on the state and local level to look at as far as helping. Identifying those opportunities are key. So there's retention incentives. We're actually going to talk about a few of them here in a moment that could be applied to retention, so that if you're in any of those communities, something to think about. But there's capital investments, there's tax credits, there's credits that you have to take on your taxes, and if you don't have a tax nexus, or you're at an NOL, whatever it is, there are some states and communities where you can sell those credits to someone else, so at least you can get the value it was intended to be, the offset to help you retain or grow or invest in your facility. There's tax increment financing districts that can help with taking property taxes and actually giving you assistance soon. So you're paying your property taxes over 20 years, but there's opportunities where you can relieve the cash pressure now, and we'll say forward those benefits more immediately. And there's complexities that vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that opportunity is there in a lot of different places. Training incentives are some of the more robust. There's federal programs, there's state programs, and sometimes there's local programs. The common misnomer that I hear a lot is that you do not need to, you don't have to have all your people go to a community college everywhere. There are some places you have to have that. There are some places that will just on-the-job training has been recognized as a key function, and that you'll be reimbursed and rebated for those costs of OJT. There are quite a bit of programs there for training as well. So just look at these opportunities and how they can help. A lot of times those 80,000 plus programs can be combined into many. It's not just one and done. You can actually layer on to get the most help that's required. Here's a few examples of some retention incentives. They're not perfect, and they're not going to fit everybody, but Missouri Works, New York Excelsior, and the Illinois Enterprise Zone program are all programs that do allow in different ways retention. And what we hope, what we're seeing, thankfully, is that many of these governments are looking upon retention as the new incredibly critical pathway that needs to be helped. Just keeping employers healthy so that they can retain their workers. So we're seeing quite a bit of a shift in a good way on the way that different economic development groups, as well as different leadership along some of these states and many others, look upon retention as just as important as growing jobs. And that's not always the case yet. But more and more everyday organizations are seeing that retention, state organizations especially, are seeing retention to be key. And that's going to be important moving forward. Because while we're dealing with the humanity issues of the pandemic, the health and safety issues, hopefully a couple months from now, past Memorial Day, we're going to start to get back to work. And when we get back to work, everything's going to look different. There's going to be a lot of businesses that didn't survive. There's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to be different than what they were in February, March. So it's important because we're going to need to be able to get these folks some help, and start thinking about that now. Don't start thinking about that in June or July. Get in front of some of these organizations now. Capital investment's another thing. So capital investment doesn't mean you need to build a whole new building. Capital investment in some instances can be just adding an HVAC system or doing the common improvements that you're planning on doing anyways that you have to over the next few years or months or weeks. Kansas has a really great program. Virginia has a really great program for that. And then, of course, there's utilities all across the country and globally that if you're making a capital investment, retaining your workforce, maybe growing a little bit, but just retaining your workforce, you can get special discounts or riders, economic development riders, on your utility that could save millions of dollars. Look at all those programs because they're important to businesses now that could really, really be helpful. A couple examples between state tax credits and how they differ. So Illinois, Wisconsin, a lot of companies are trying to figure out what side of the border they want to be on in the future, and not a place to talk about who may be better suited, but more importantly, there's a difference. That's our point here on this slide. There's a difference between these state credits. What you can use on the edge in Illinois is different from what those business development tax credits in Wisconsin can give you. The edge is not refundable from a cash outlay standpoint. Wisconsin's main program is you can sell those credits, or forgive me, not sell. The state government will give you the cash value if you can't use it in that year. So there's a big difference between the two. Now, rest assured, state governments, Illinois, Wisconsin, and many others are already trying to figure out, the leadership is trying to figure out how they can adjust, even if temporarily, some of these programs to help businesses retain workers, to be honest. So we're keeping track of that. Many discussions are underway. I think their number one concern is if you're already taking advantage of EDGE and you're already taking advantage of Wisconsin, the Business Development Enterprise Zone Program, one of them, or the Business Development Tax Credit Program, both these states and many other states recognize that from a compliance standpoint, and this is going to be our topic of our next webinar coming up, what states and communities are doing to just recognize that a lot of people can't even hire right now. You can't interview people, you can't hire, you can't expand, you can't do anything right now. So we don't want people to get sideways on the agreements and the incentives that are already in place. So we're going to be talking about that in our next webinar next time. But just know that these states are trying to figure that out. New Jersey being one of them, and the Grow New Jersey program lifted a requirement that was really important to Grow New Jersey that required folks, and I'm using this terminology loosely, but essentially that 80% of the workforce had to be located in that site that was being given Grow New Jersey benefits. Well, a few weeks back, the EDA, NGA, EDA, and the governor's office relieved businesses temporarily of that requirement because nobody was working in an office. And that's more of the practical element of all this. But moving forward, I think in most jurisdictions, there's going to be a lot of flexibility. But it's really important to know what that is before asking your economic development professionals, because it's just going to help everybody try to figure out how to help each and every company as best we all can. In addition, there's property tax abatements, there's tax increment financing, there's these tools available to help companies grow over the long term. Just be careful, because importantly, and accountability wise, there's commitments to these, and you just have to know what you're getting into. Read the fine print, because no economic development professional I've ever met wants a company to sign on to something that they can't commit to. So just be very careful about reading between the lines on any kind of commitment. Job training incentives, I mentioned it earlier, great opportunity. There's federal programs, there's states, there's massive money, billions of dollars worth of money available for things that are that would normally be given by workforce councils locally for just community college and some other stuff. Now, many of those workforce councils are going to be focused on outplacement and other retraining efforts to try to get the workers that you just can't hold on to be retrained for new skills and new opportunities in the future. So one other thing I want to cover before we take some of your questions is deploying location strategy and incentives together. So we're a site selection firm. We do a lot of different things around trying to help people with location strategy all over the world. We as a firm, as I mentioned earlier, have about 400 to 500 active projects. We've got about a dozen that we're trying to do site tours right now virtually. But a question that came up recently that I think is just fascinating is, in today's world, think about if the Amazon headquarters project was set to make a decision in May of this year, as opposed to last year. What would that mean? What do they have to look at that's different from today? How does the world differ? We've talked about a few of those things, anecdotally, but in a real live scenario, would they have picked New York as a front runner because of density and concentration risks? Maybe not. Maybe they would have dispersed those 50,000 jobs a bit wider. Maybe Virginia wouldn't have gotten so many. Maybe they're doing that right now. And that's the thing that many of the companies that we work with are thinking and contemplating. Do I have a headquarters the way it looks like today? Is it going to be that way in the next couple of years? Do I have to diversify core function? Because of every other reason, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, so lots of organizations have done that previous. Before Hurricane Sandy, a lot of equipment was at the basement level. Well, now in today's world, a lot of that equipment's been moved up to second or third stories all over the world because of Hurricane Sandy. Those are the things that we've really come to realize, and the pandemic is going to be no different. How is concentration and diversity around our workforce going to become a challenge? And this is what we look at when we deploy some of the strategic things that we do around services is talent demographics, transportation, and cost and risk. How's that going to happen? How's that going to affect companies in the future? Right now in New York, we're seeing unprecedented challenges with supply chain. There are workers, 70% in distribution centers not showing up because they're either sick or they're self-quarantining. That's a big deal. In the same distribution center, trucks a little bit further out are not willing to enter the Northeast, let alone the New York market. So we're seeing massive supply chain shortages that's only going to get worse, unfortunately, until this subsides, which I know we're seeing the bright light at the end of the tunnel, which is so great. It seems to be here in New York. Hospitalizations are flatlining a bit around that curve that everyone's talked about. And then obviously deaths are seem to be stabilizing, though I think anybody that's been affected by the virus is in our thoughts and prayers, and we want everyone to get as healthy as possible before we think about this and really emphasize. But come around the Memorial Day timeframe, I think a lot of organizations, before they start their budgetary season in the fall, are going to be thinking about what the heck do I do next? And so for those of you that are coaching organizations, just think about that. That now is probably not the most appropriate time, because many of the companies we support are just trying to figure out, if they're an essential business, what are the rules in this county? What are the rules in this country? What are the rules in this city? And they're all different, let alone trying to figure out what the future is going to hold. But when the dust settles, what is going to happen to what's going to happen when we hit future waves of this thing? The pandemic of the past in 1918 and some of these other pandemics that we've seen, certainly epidemics, have had 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 waves. So I think what we're hearing out of Washington and our government is advising this could be seasonal, and that as the winter kicks up, before it's totally eradicated and a vaccine is developed, a city all of a sudden gets affected by the virus, that city is going to get locked down. We're used to that now. We're not used to it happening over 24 or 48 hours, and that will happen. Who knows where, but the likeliness from a seasonality standpoint, as conditions change, humidity goes away, temperature changes, just everything changes, the Northeast and the upper Midwest may be adversely affected. So a town may get locked in or locked down so much faster than it ever would have imagined. And what happens to your workers? Are you in a city where the propensity of going virtual is there right away? The challenges that we feel with bandwidth and things at home, not personal or patients, but just the actual latency of your networks, that's not going to change that much between here and there. So these are all things that companies are taking a look at. Do I have to diversify my customer experience professionals, my call centers, my manufacturing to other places short term, have some more hub and spokes? And that's a big challenge. And then long term, if I would have said to anybody 6 months ago that the top 3 things you have to consider is cost, risk, and pandemics, they probably would have laughed me out of a room. But that's going to be the case for a long time in the future, about how to factor all these things in. And that's where there's some of these things that I have on the screen. The other thing to think about from an incentive strategy standpoint is that there's a life cycle to incentives. You got to look first at what economic development professionals will appreciate when you could come to them with a more clear picture of what it is the problem is and what that you need as best as you can. They will come to you then in return with what they think could be brought to bear to help. But the more that you could be prepared when you walk through that door or email them or whatever it is, the better it's going to be. They're going to need to negotiate with their stakeholders, come back to you, figure out what the best fit. And then there's a lot of legal construction that takes place. There's going to be forms and agreements and things you have to have to sign, and that's key. And those are big risks, so be careful of the commitments you make. And then there's the aftercare. What happens a lot in organizations is that there's a lot of attention put into a project during the site selection phase when people sign up for incentives. Then, and we're talking about incentives specifically here, then some of those people start to go do other things, and it's settled onto someone that might be in middle management that's kind of in charge of those moving forward. Well, the middle managers move around the most. They're put into finance, they're put into accounting, they're put into other places. And what happens is, accidentally, the compliance goes by the wayside. And we see in the newspaper way too often when companies fall into a trap of accidentally of not being able to help facilitate the whole process, unfortunately. Lastly, just want to reiterate again, there's this microsite we've built. It's open source. It's available to everybody, free of charge. We're going to update it on a constant basis. It's updated literally every moment of every day almost. globally in nature. There are programs in place in Australia, in Singapore, in Scotland, in France, and in South America, and a lot of other places that can help people along the way. So I encourage you to look at that website on a regular basis. And then finally, our next webinar, which is going to be on April 23rd, is going to handle specifically, mentioned this before, what are some of the compliance challenges that we have to think about? Force majeure, renegotiating, those are things that we didn't even think about, but having the conversation with your economic development professional is going to be key. How do you, if you can't meet your commitments anymore, how do you open up your agreement that you already have in place to try to mitigate that? And many economic development professionals have already been faced with this before due to the Great Recession. This is going to happen again, unfortunately. So we're going to address some of these things, and looking forward to having you all participate with that. There's a little link on the bottom there, as you can see here. Anyone that got an email about this webinar will get it again for the future webinar, but this will also be on our website and wherever you get our webinars. This will be there into the future. So in addition, every day you can connect with us, join the conversation. We're on all the social media platforms, and we'll try to keep everybody up to date. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or need anything, and we've got a great team of over 50 professionals all over the world that can help with anything you need as well. But always feel free to get in contact with me in the future. So I want to stop there. We've got about 10 minutes left or so. I want to be respectful of your time, so we'll adjourn here at the top of the hour. But I want to answer questions that you may have. There's a few that have already come in that want to try to help with as best as we can. So there's a few questions that have specifically to do with the credit, or I'm sorry, the individual and the business assistance over the short term, and I want to answer some of those because I think they're key. A lot of attention has been given to those programs as they exist, and I want to make sure I address them. So one has to do with the individual IRS check that we're looked at. There is if you qualify for the base amount, there's $1,200, $1,200 US dollars that you'll receive as early as next week if you had set up direct deposit in 2018 and 2019 in your tax filings through the federal government, through the IRS. If you didn't do that, either in both years, there's a high probability you might receive an actual check. That their Treasury advising this morning was saying that may take a month or so. Unfortunately, it's not a fast process, but it's $2,400 for married couples that qualify for that baseline amount. But the question is, $75,000, the amount that is the top line qualifying. Anything above that, it starts to dilute a bit. The way it's structured is $75,000 is you reported as income on your last two federal filings. So if one of those was above 75,000, you may get a diluted amount. If it wasn't, then you should receive the 1,200 amount. What we've been advised with by the federal government, the IRS, and a bunch of other really smart people is that if you don't receive what you think that you should have received, you should call the IRS directly, and they will guide some additional things. It's going to take a while for it to get caught up, but they have said over and over again that if somebody receives the incorrect amount, they will do everything and they can quickly to get the difference accordingly. And there is some talk within the federal government that it may end up becoming a tax credit if that doesn't seem like a practical thing. But the federal government is doing everything they can to send out that money and to align it with what they believe your income is, your posted income on your tax return. Sometimes there's a case-by-case basis. Many of you have different returns. Some of you have different different income streams that show up on that return, it really varies quite a bit. But if you're just a simple W-2 employee without a lot of additional income, they're going to look at your final income that is reported with that tax return. Another great question about incentives. So, excuse me. So incentives have largely been based on average salary, CapEx, and number of jobs. What does that mean around solutions in the future? Specifically, which I think is asked well, are there states developing creative incentives specifically to remote employees? Give any examples, kind of out of the box. And the answer is yes. So Utah is one of my favorite examples of, they have a very specific program in place where they incentivize companies to hire Utah residents that are in remote situations to bring them onto the payroll. So that's very exciting. Another is that folks that commute to work, or who would already commute but work from an alternative location. Vermont is another state, and New Hampshire is considering the same thing, that will incentivize, it's not the employee, but in the employer, but in fact, it's the employee to work from home remotely to live, because a lot of these jurisdictions, remote Utah, some of the Northeast states have seen a lot of population migration away from those places. So they're trying to add some incentives to help stop that migration in a negative way, and also try to induce employers to hire those people where they're not physically in the office. So some things that won't be a problem, at least over the short term, is that a lot of companies are going to not want people to come back to work right away unless they have to. They might have staggered and they're doing this in places like Singapore right now, where you might have, of the entire workforce, you might have a third of them show up at a work site every week. So eventually you get all of those workers within 3 weeks to come, but it helps diminish some of the risk. We may see that in some American cities coming up as well. But there are programs out there, and we believe strongly there's going to be more programs to help incentivize, because all of a sudden working from home and remote isn't as, there were some managers and companies nervous about that. A lot of that nervousness has gone away. And so I think we're going to see more and more comfort about remote working. Places like China that hasn't really embraced remote working at all saw the most incredible experiment, still going on now, but less. But 84% of their workforce was working remotely for some time not too long ago. So all of a sudden you had a society that didn't really embrace working from home. Then you have a large majority of the workforce working from home and working remote over systems like Zoom and WebEx and GoToMeeting and some of their versions, all of a sudden needing to do it. So I think you're going to see in cultures around the world start to embrace this in different ways, because while we're all stuck at home, the work-life balance is a bit stressful. But on a normal day, the work-life balance is actually very appealing to a lot of people. And I think if you can balance the way that we are now with kids and parents and everybody learning and everybody working and teachers needing to teach and learn and do all the things that have to go on in a normal space, working from home may not be all that bad, and it might be appealing for a lot of people. So companies will have to respond to that, I think accordingly. One other question, and then we have about a minute left. So this will be our last one. Another question that's come up is, what's the best way to identify credits and incentives and things that we've talked about today that can benefit your organization? And the one thing I would say is talk to an expert. An expert, from my perspective, is an economic development professional in your region. I think there's a lot of great folks out there. Now, they're inundated right now with questions and trying to help as many businesses as they can. The Department of Commerce's and the economic development teams in many places around the U.S. and globally have become the one-stop shop for businesses to call up and say, I need help. And the phones are literally ringing off the hook. And so literally, these organizations have been getting millions of calls where they're normally used to getting hundreds of calls. So it's an unprecedented way. So use other resources out there, providers you have Right at the bottom of your screen is our microsite. That's a place to start. That at least what we can recommend. And I hope that economic developers on this call and just in general appreciate this, is that just go to them with some semblance of an idea of what you need that's more specific with the tools that they've got. And I know they're all experts, economic developers, in trying to figure out what tools are best. But with the shortened bandwidth that everyone's got, try to go to them with ideas and focuses that may help you the most, so that you can try to get to a solution faster. And I think I think that'll help everyone the most. So there's a few more questions. I think it's 1 minute after the top of the hour. We'll adjourn here. We'll try to answer those specifically one-on-one, but I can't thank everyone enough for joining today. I hope everyone the best health and safety. Whatever you do, if you didn't listen to anything else that we talked about today, wash your hands many times a day, cough or sneeze into your elbow like this, and social distance as long as it takes to get us through this unbelievable crisis we're all facing. But I think the light's out of the end of the tunnel, and I hope everyone, this is a period of time celebrating some holidays as well, and I hope everybody is safe and healthy that's joining us today, and wish you all the best. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.